Focus in a battle is easy. How do you keep focus in a long war?
Akira. Well, that can definitely be true. It can be pretty easy to focus on the battle that's right in front of your face. And when you're doing that, sometimes you can lose track of the long-term goal. The long-term goal. The long-term goal. Make it happen. Make it happen. The long-term goal. The long-term goal. Never lose sight of it. Ever. I want to have that long-term goal so embedded in my mind that I never lose sight of it. Ever. And those little tasks and projects and short-term goals that you tackle, they need to lead toward that strategic victory. Winning the long war. The long-term goal. The long-term goal. Make it happen. Make it happen. The long-term goal. The long-term goal. Never lose sight of it. Ever. And we get very caught up in instant gratification. We want results now. We want the shortcut to the winner's podium. And sometimes, when we don't get that short-term glory that we want, we lose track of those long-term goals. And you look up in 6 weeks or in 6 months or in 6 years and you've made no progress. None. You never moved. You might even be further from your goal than you were. Why? Why did you let that happen? It's because you lost sight of that. The long-term goal. The long-term goal. Make it happen. Make it happen. The long-term goal. The long-term goal. Never lose sight of it. Ever. And at some point, after you lose sight of that goal and years have gone by, you think to yourself, maybe I can't. Maybe I can't do it. And so you give up. You let it fade. And you settle. You settle for mediocrity. You settle for average. You settle for, oh well. But no. Don't do that. Embed that long-term goal in your mind. Burn it into your soul. Think about it, write about it, talk about it, hang it up on your wall. But most important, do something about it. Do something about it every day. Every day, do something that moves you toward that goal, that keeps the goal alive and in sight and in focus. However small or insignificant that step might seem, take it to it. Do that little piece. Make it happen. Make it happen. Because that goal isn't going to achieve
14. So we're going to start with some reading and then practice some meditation, yoga, and then martial arts. Okay. I turn off the AC and I have my little space heater going in here, but it's too warm to open a window. So we're going to be reading the last section of Marxism versus identity politics. We'll read for about 20 or 30 minutes, and then sit for about 20 or 30 minutes, and then 30 minutes of yoga, 30 minutes of martial arts exercises. And as you can see behind me, I don't practice dumb stuff that doesn't work. I only practice the things that work in real life for real fighters, real soldiers, revolutionaries. So I'm going to bring this in so you can hear me. Back up, buddy. Okay. So there's just a few more pages of this pamphlet from the Revolutionary Communists of America. And we're on the section called Terminological Radicalism. In place of a genuine struggle for equality, we are offered artificial quotas. In place of the struggle for emancipation through a revolutionary reconstruction of society, we are offered, quote, political correctness. This boils down to endless petty quibbling over words and semantics, the impermissibility of using this or that word, the need to change gender-based language, and so on and so forth. In the true spirit of postmodernist narrative that substitutes the word for the deed, endless time has been wasted in certain countries where people who describe themselves as leftists or even Marxists perform verbal acrobatics to twist language, neutralizing masculine and feminine forms, ending up with mutations like compañeras in Spanish, in Italian, and so on. This kind of playing with words does nothing whatsoever to advance the struggle for the emancipation of women, black people, or anybody else. It is tokenism of the crudest and most ridiculous kind. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels already dealt with the idea that by changing the consciousness of individuals, you can change material conditions, and that in order to have a revolution, you first need to, quote, educate people, both for the production on a mass scale of this communist consciousness and for the success of the cause itself. The alteration of men on a mass scale is, of necessity, an alteration which can only take place in a practical movement, a revolution. This revolution is necessary, therefore, not only because the ruling class cannot be overthrown in any other way, but also because the class overthrowing it can only, in a revolution, succeed in ridding itself of all the muck of ages and become fitted to found society anew. The postmodernist obsession with language puts the whole question upside down. Changing the language will not change one iota the real fact of oppression. To think so reveals a completely idealistic approach. Language changes and evolves, reflecting changes in the real world, but the converse is patently untrue. Squabbles about words is a tendency that is typical of university seminars, where people have all the time in the world to dedicate to endless arguments about nothing in particular, like a dog chasing its own tail. The German poet Goethe wrote, "In the beginning was the deed." What is required to bring about the emancipation of women is action to combat oppression and discrimination. But the prior condition of successful mass action is precisely the militant unity of working class women and men against the bosses whose rule is based on the common enslavement of all workers. It seems that the radical petty bourgeoisie must always have something or other to fuss about, such as the so-called queer theory. This is not the place to analyze this theory in detail. This can be done in separate documents and articles. Suffice it to say that this is a thoroughly reactionary concept, rooted in philosophical idealism in its crudest form. It sows divisions that undermine the struggle against oppression and inevitably play into the hands of reaction, irrespective of the intentions of those who espouse these notions. Marxism is based on philosophical materialism, the only truly scientific method for analyzing nature, society, and human behavior. Whether one likes it or not, sex in the animal world, including human animals, is a normal method of reproduction. Asexual reproduction exists in the animal world, for example in earthworms and certain fishes. But it disappears with the development of evolution and is totally absent amongst mammals. Sex is not something that people have consciously determined or invented. It was a product of evolution. The idea that sex can be determined artificially by human volition is both arbitrary and philosophically and scientifically false. The fundamental sexual division is between male and female. This is naturally determined by the reproductive process. This in turn carries within it the germ of the division of labor, which at a certain stage becomes the basis of class divisions in society. The subjugation of women to men, expressed in patriarchal family relations, coincides with the beginnings of class society, and will only finally be eradicated after the abolition of class society itself. Marxists fight for the real emancipation of women and all other oppressed sections of society, but emancipation cannot be achieved merely by imagining that there is no such thing as gender. One can imagine oneself to be anything one pleases, but in the end, one is compelled to accept material reality over mental meanderings of philosophical idealism. Among the innumerable weird and wonderful variants of queer theory, we should not really dignify this as a theory at all. There appears to be a common thread. Firstly, it presents gender, and even sex, as a purely social construct, denying all biological and material aspects. The next step is to create in the imagination an almost infinite variety of genders from which everyone is free to take their pick. We do not deny the fact that in addition to male and female, there are indeterminate forms, which have been known for a very long time. In pre-Columbian America, such people were regarded as a special social group and treated with respect. Modern science enables people to change their sex, and this should be available to any person that requires it. It goes without saying that we are totally opposed to any form of discrimination and intolerance towards transgender people, nor do we have any objection to anyone identifying as they please. However, by presenting this as a means of changing society, we end up with the idea, highly convenient for the ruling class, that emancipation is purely a question of personal lifestyle choice. We see the negative effects of this kind of thing in the ugly splits and bitter feuding between some radical feminists and some trans right activists. Such developments cannot be said to serve the fight against oppression in any sense, shape, or form. They are thoroughly reactionary and must be combated. Quote, identity, end quote, in the labor movement. Marxists fight for the emancipation of women and will defend every progressive measure, no matter how partial, that tends to improve the status of women even within the limits of the present capitalist system. But we will conduct this fight with our own methods, that is to say, the method of proletarian class struggle. We point out that in the last analysis, the real and full emancipation of women can only be established on the basis of a root and branch transformation of society, that is to say, by means of a socialist revolution. But the prior condition for this is that the working class must be united and conscious of its revolutionary tasks. Marxists are opposed to and fight against any kind of oppression or discrimination. But in opposing and fighting oppression and discrimination, we must never forget that our main aim is to fight for socialism, and that means above all to defend the unity of the working class. We stand for the complete unity of the working class, above all distinctions of gender, ethnicity, language, or religion. Whatever serves to preserve the unity of the workers and raise their class consciousness is progressive. Whatever tends to divide the workers for whatever reason is reactionary and must be combated. This is a point which we must insist on. The oppression of women, and the particular oppression of working class women, as well as other scourges of capitalism, such as the destruction of the environment or national oppression, are an integral part of capitalism. You cannot have capitalism without domestic slavery or the, quote, double burden faced by working class women. You cannot have capitalism without the devastation of the planet due to the thirst for profit of the big multinationals. You cannot have capitalism without the enslavement of the small nations by the imperialist powers to plunder their resources and ensure their hegemony against their other powers. Hence, the only real way of putting an end to all these scourges is through the socialist transformation of society, led by the working class. The bureaucracy of the labor movement has learned to play off different groups of workers against each other, allowing pay differentials between different sections of the working class. The trade union leaders, looking for an easy life and a compromise with the bosses, sell out certain groups of workers in return for concessions for others. In other and more countries, positive discrimination is systematically used by the bureaucracy to fill leading positions in the labor movements with careerist elements who use their gender or ethnicity to push themselves forward, aided and abetted by the right-wing bureaucracy, elbowing left-wing candidates to one side. When I got out of prison, when I was a political prisoner and I got out, I saw a lot of liberals getting into government organizations like the EPA or the Florida version of the Environmental Protection Agency, and they were infiltrating the activist movement here in Tallahassee like Food Not Bombs, and they would go in with this crazy liberal bullshit and completely disrupt the practical efficacy of these activist groups. And they would target men, they would target white people, and they would go out of their way to try to set people up and entrap them. And you got to remember that a cop that is a liberal is still a cop. They're still actively trying to set up any kind of revolutionary, socialist, any kind of actually effective activist. These liberal police are police first and foremost. And the police are inherently racist and sexist, whether or not they portray themselves as progressive liberals. And again, I'll say this every day on here, do not trust liberals they will betray you. If you're an activist, if you're a leftist, a socialist, a communist, if you're a revolutionary, even if you're just an anarchist, liberals will go out of their way to become cops in government agencies so that they can get the power to set you up and betray you. That's what they do. That's what they've always done from the beginning of every socialist revolution. The bureaucrats are keen to establish, quote, reserved seats for women, black people, etc. for their own reasons. Oh, one more thing. If you look at the website for the CIA and the FBI, the first thing you'll see is that they are claiming to be LGBTQ friendly and progressive and feminist, and they do that to draw people away from the revolutionary activist crowd, the strong and militant people. The FBI and the CIA are actively recruiting those people. And they often will recruit them out of activist circles and tell them to stay in those circles. My probation officer regularly tells me, oh, you should go to Food Not Bombs. My opinion is because Food Not Bombs is compromised at the deepest level. And when I say that, I mean that they are heavily infiltrated by the FBI and the CIA, and they actively report on any activist who is doing anything effective. And this Marxism versus identity politics talks about how the CIA and the FBI, they quote declassified CIA documents where they actively brag about hijacking the LGBTQ movement in order to derail effective revolutionary groups and individuals. The trade union bureaucracy in particular uses this device in order to dilute the composition of elected bodies. They lean on groups of careerist bureaucracies who supposedly represent, quote, special groups, who thus made their way up the ladder through such patronage. And these are happy to support the leadership as long as they are given autonomy to push their, quote, issues, rather than giving representation to these, quote, special groups. What is achieved is an even less representative leadership, not elected on the basis of their actual political positions, but simply to satisfy quotas and so on. And before I go on, I'll circle back to that. The Environmental Protection Agency and the regional state versions of that agency are now the main government organization for infiltrating local activist groups, especially environmentalist groups. Moving on. The insistence on gender or ethnicity as the main issue tends to divide people, not on the basis of class, but of other considerations. The consequences of this are extremely negative for the working class. It is not an accident that the far-right trade union leaders, and the reformists and left reformists in particular, everywhere use, quote, political correctness and, quote, identity politics to divert attention from the class struggle and from the real issues facing the working class. They concentrate on questions of language rather than fighting oppression with militant class struggle. These pernicious ideas are weapons in the hands of the most reactionary sections of the trade union bureaucracy, the main role of which is to police the working class and limit the scope and effectiveness of the class struggle to the traditional armory of the bureaucracy's police methods. The threat of disciplinary measures, the removal of militant shop stewards, expulsions, etc., is now added a new method, intimidation and witch hunts by the fanatics of, quote, identity politics. At one trade union congress in Britain, the advocates of identity politics moved a resolution that stated that the union must automatically accept any accusation of harassment made by a woman against a man as true, with no further proof than the word of the woman concerned. A male delegate challenged this as follows: I am a shop steward. Imagine that I have a woman supervisor who wants to get rid of me. She would have a very easy task. Just accuse me of harassment, and I would be sacked immediately, and the union could not defend me. On this occasion, the motion was defeated, but the danger of such policies is evident. The reason they are not being seriously challenged is not because they have won the argument, but because people are afraid of being bullied by the proponents of identity politics. Anyone who dares to object to the intrigues is immediately branded a racist, a misogynist, or any other colorful epithet that occurs to them. This has led to hooligan conduct and vicious campaigns of slander directed against left-wing trade unionists who are witch-hunted on trumped-up charges. Complaints are immediately drowned out by the shouting and bawling of the advocates of identity politics, who do not hesitate to hurl the most scandalous insults and abuse against their opponents. The principle of quotas is in reality the most blatant kind of rigging. Many a right-winger has been elected with the justification that he or she represents this or that minority group. But everyone keeps quiet about this for fear of being denounced, allegedly, of defending discrimination. In Britain, Tony Blair was eager to use all-women shortlists to select careerist members of parliament and squeeze out the left. Ironically, it was the trendy lefts who originally pushed these ideas as part of their positive discrimination agenda. Thus, they played right into the hands of the right wing. The right wing of the Labour Party used the national question to undermine Jeremy Corbyn, who proposed 2 extra seats of the NEC, one from Wales and another from Scotland, arguing that the nation should be represented. By a strange coincidence, both the Scottish and Welsh Labour parties were controlled by the right wing. The left reformists, always keen to prove themselves and to present themselves as the most feminist, insist more forcefully on this. They insist on quotas and special treatment for women and others. Podemos, Momentum, and others go much further on these questions than the traditional labor movement, which reflects the petty bourgeois influence on these organizations. One of the reactionary consequences of quotas are that they deepen division and competition within the working class. In the present period of acute crisis of capitalism, with cuts and austerity being carried out by all governments, a whole number of reactionary ideas can get the ear of certain backward sections of the working class, who can draw the reactionary conclusion that our problems do not derive from capitalism as such, but from the presence of national minorities and immigrants, from women claiming rights, etc. This is the basis of the propaganda of the fascist and most reactionary right-wing movements. We do not have enough jobs or crutches, or we have limited access to university or social benefits, etc., due to the quotas granted to national minorities, to gender, etc. End quote. All this helps to spread the poison of racism and division within the working class. Besides, those elected on the basis of a quota will always be considered as second-rate, and what they say can easily be dismissed by saying that they do not have a mandate, but are only elected because they are women, black, gay, or whatever quota they were elected through. And you see this with the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. I joined them when I became a communist because they were the only communist/socialist organization in Tallahassee. But when I go to their meetings, which are very infrequent, and they play card games and board games, and when they do have serious political talks, there's no discussion allowed, and they don't allow white people or male people to speak. We would go around the table, and I would be like, we go in a circle around the table, and when it came to me, I was like, oh yeah. And they'd be like, well, hold on, this person, this minority, this feminine person wants to speak, and we're gonna let them speak first. And I was like, okay, it seemed like a good policy at the time. And after all these other people spoke, I was like, okay, cool, can I say it? And they're like, oh no, we're moving on. And I'm like, well, I have real life experience of this section we just read. Can I contribute? I've been in revolutionary militant organizations overseas. In Rojava, I was in the YPG International. And they're like, no, stop talking, we're moving on. And other people were like, well, Dan wanted to say something. Like, why don't you let Dan speak? And they're like, no, we're moving on. We're sticking to the agenda of the meeting. And I wasn't trying to argue, I was agreeing with what had been read. I don't go to people's meetings just to disrupt anything. I only speak if I'm going to contribute positively to the conversation. So, that was a really negative experience, and I was like, man, that was really disrespectful and rude. And I waited quietly and patiently for all the women, all the minorities, all the LGBTQ people to go first, and they just refused to let me speak. So, this is a tactic of military intelligence agencies all around the world. And I'm not just suggesting, I'm outright stating the Freedom Road Socialist Organization is a compromised organization. And that's why I left them and I joined the Revolutionary Communists of America. Recently I was tabling for the RCA, and a few members of the FRSO approached me and they were passing out their flyers. And I was like, oh, hey, it's nice to see you guys. And I'm just being polite, and the flyer that they handed me for their event was a party. And, all they do is have parties for bourgeois kids, bourgeois college students, and they play board games and card games, and they have parties. They go to protests and they talk a good talk, but really they're steering and defanging revolutionary movements into a useless direction. In Brazil, the situation is even worse. Almost the entire left has capitulated to the atrocious proposal to divide the entire population on lines of, quote, ethnicity in order to then introduce quotas in universities, etc., something our Brazilian comrades have taken an implacable stand against. They have argued that what we should fight for is for education, healthcare, housing, etc., for all. An achievable goal, given the wealth that exists in society, rather than viewing these resources as scarce and subsequently fighting for their proportional allocation. We are implacably opposed to so-called positive discrimination, quotas, representation, and all the rest. The way to ensure the maximum participation of women and minorities in the labor movement is to prove in action, not words, that we are fighting against all kinds of oppression and discrimination, for jobs for all, equal wages for work of equal value, etc. Only on the basis of a fighting program will we succeed in drawing in the most oppressed layers of society. But that means that the leadership must be in the hands of the best fighters, whether they are men or women, black or white, straight or gay. This empty tokenism was introduced into the labor movement, firstly through the white-collar unions based on the middle-class professions. They were closest to the middle-class intellectuals and students. As a result of deindustrialization and trade union mergers, these layers elbowed aside the workers. The more middle-class types, who are more articulate, or at least shout louder, were able to infect the movement with their, quote, trendy ideas, which they established as an accepted norm. This has affected the unions in many countries to one degree or another. Thus, we have reserved seats for women, LGBTQ, black people, disabled, and others, no doubt. They have their own separate conferences, committees, etc., each with their own little bureaucracies. They insist that they alone can decide on these issues. And as long as they do not rock the boat for the rest of the union bureaucracy, they are allowed to run their own fiefdoms. The left reformists and sectarians accept this state of affairs because their ideas and policies are also petty bourgeois in character. Reaction against liberal feminism. Middle-class women are clamoring for new career outlets, to become women bankers, CEOs, bishops, or even the President of the United States. This is a new variant on the old song of reformists. Quote, I am in favor of improving the conditions of the working class, one by one, commencing with myself. End quote. Precisely in what way the entry of women into the boardrooms of banks helps the cause of women workers is not explained. Are women bosses any kinder to their employees than male ones? The record is not very encouraging in this respect. And just how the successes of Margaret Thatcher, Angela Merkel, or Theresa May have helped the cause of their, quote, sisters on the factory floor is a mystery that remains to be solved. Gradually, a growing number of politically conscious women have come to understand the negative aspects of feminism. They see that instead of combating capitalism as an exploitative and oppressive system, quote, lean-in feminism encourages women to think of the movement only insofar as it leads to individual gains for a certain layer of women. In her book, Why I Am Not a Feminist, Jessa Crispin has described feminism as a self-serving brand popularized by CEOs and beauty companies, a, quote, fight to allow women to participate equally in the oppression of the powerless and the poor, end quote. That is not badly said, although one notes that despite the book's title, Jessa Crispin still describes herself as a feminist. The New Yorker comments, quote, why I am not a feminist comes at a time when some portion of liberal women in America might be ready for a major shift, inclined suddenly toward a belief system that does not hallow the, quote, markers of a success in patriarchal capitalism, money, and power, as Crispin puts it. There is, it seems, a growing hunger for a feminism concerned more with the lives of low-income women than with the number of female CEOs, end quote. The opposing view, that feminism is not just broadly compatible with capitalism but actually serves it, has certainly enjoyed its share of prominence. This is the message that has been passed down by the vast majority of self-styled feminist role models over the past 10 years. That feminism is what you call it when an individual woman gets enough money to do whatever she wants. Crispin is ruthless in dissecting this brand of feminism. It means simply buying one's way out of oppression and then perpetuating it, she argues. It embraces the patriarchal model of happiness, which depends on, quote, having someone else to subject to your will, end quote. Women exploited for centuries have grown subconsciously eager to exploit others, Crispin believes. Quote, once we are part of the system and benefiting from it on the same level that men are, we won't care, as a group, about whose turn it is to get hurt, end quote. The crisis of feminism finds its reflection in a rapid leftward turn of politics in the USA in the direction of socialism and anti-capitalism, particularly since the election of Donald Trump. The reactionary nature of identity politics was clearly exposed in the 2016 US election, when Hillary Clinton, the most consummate representative of Wall Street and the billionaire class, appealed to women to vote for her because, quote, I am a woman, end quote. And again, this thing about, quote unquote activist feminists, women, going after people just to vent their anger, because they certainly have been oppressed, but then they turn around and will set up innocent men just, for practice when they run into a real one, I guess, eventually. And right when I got out of prison, there was a few informants in the activist community who kept trying to introduce me to some crazy women and leave me alone with them, and were insisting on coming over to be alone with me at my apartment. And I had to tell everyone, I have a policy of nobody comes to my apartment. Bottom line, stay the fuck away from my home. I just got out of federal prison. I'm on probation. I don't want nobody alone in my apartment with me unless I've known them for like 10 or more years. Fuck off. And I put up Ring cameras, right? Once I put up security cameras, they stopped trying to come over to my place, because then they wouldn't be able to easily set me up and entrap me, right? There were even people who were trying to send me text messages saying, oh, well, if you don't send me a bunch of money, then I'm going to make false reports about you. And all right, I took screenshots and sent it to my lawyer, and then that stopped, right? But if you hear a activist saying that they support women's wrongs, that is a cop, and they are infiltrating the movement to try to use feminism to make false accusation against effective activists and to derail the movement. Former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, that hardened reactionary and warmonger, introducing Hillary Clinton at an event in New Hampshire, told the crowd and voters in general, there's a special place in hell for women who don't help each other. In the event, millions of American women rejected this appeal to gender politics and turned their backs on Clinton and Albright and supported Sanders. This was a real kick in the teeth for the proponent of, quote, identity politics. This showed that the women in the USA, when voting for a candidate in the presidential elections, consider the policy and ideas of the candidate to be far more important than their gender. In that they are quite correct, through it, though it was unfortunate that the only alternative before them was the arch-reactionary Donald Trump, who posed demagogically as the, quote, anti-establishment candidate. If Bernie had stood, many would have voted for him, but that is another matter. The heritage we defend. It is curious to note that Marxists are accused of neglecting or ignoring the problems of women, but the Marxists inscribed universal suffrage on their program from the very beginning. This was before the suffragettes. Eleanor Marx fought in the British trade union movement for equal pay for women. As early as 1848, Marx and Engels raised the demand for the abolition of the bourgeois family, although they recognized that this could not be carried out overnight. As soon as the Bolshevik Party took power in Russia in 1917, it carried out the most sweeping program for the emancipation of women in history, as well as the decriminalization of homosexuality, far more advanced than anything seen in the capitalist world in that period. The Bolsheviks demonstrated in practice that the overthrow of capitalism was able to guarantee women and gays far more than any amount of abstract quibbling about oppression in general. As Trotsky pointed out, the revolution made a heroic effort to destroy the so-called family hearth, that archaic, stuffy, and stagnant institution in which the women of the toiling classes performs galley labor from childhood to death. The place of the family as a shut-in petty enterprise was to be occupied, according to the plans, by a finished system of social care and accommodation, maternity houses, creches, kindergartens, schools, social dining rooms, social laundries, first aid stations, hospitals, sanatoria, athletic organizations, moving picture theaters, etc. The complete absorption of the housekeeping functions of the family by institutions of the socialist society, uniting all generations in solidarity and mutual aid, was to bring to women, and thereby to the loving couple, a real liberation from the 1,000-year-old fetters. It proved impossible to take the old family by storm, not because the will was lacking, and not because the family was so firmly rooted in men's hearts. On the contrary, after a short period of distrust of the government and its creches, kindergartens, and like institutions, the working women, and after them the more advanced peasants, appreciated the immeasurable advances of all the collective care of children as well as the socialization of the whole family economy. Unfortunately, society proved too poor and little cultured. The real resources of the state did not correspond to the plans and intentions of the Communist Party. You cannot, quote, abolish the family. You have to replace it. The actual liberation of women is unrealizable on a basis of, quote, generalized want. Experience soon proved this austere truth, which Marx had formulated 80 years before. The Revolution Betrayed, Chapter 7. Once again, on the importance of theory. What theory does the International Marxist Tendency defend? The International Marxist Tendency is now the Revolutionary Communist International. First and foremost, we stand on the basis of the ideas of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Trotsky, which have stood the test of time and remain completely relevant and valid in the world of the 21st century. We stand for the ideas of the First International, the documents of the first 4 Congresses of the Communist International, before the onset of Stalinist degeneration, and Trotsky's transitional program. These ideas have been developed and added to by the writings of Ted Grant in the decades following Trotsky's death, which are also a fundamental part of our ideological heritage. Inevitably, some comrades that have joined the organization in the recent period will not have acquired a full grasp of Marxist ideas. This will obviously take time and in itself does not pose any serious danger. However, it would be fatal if we made even the slightest concession to incorrect, alien, and petty bourgeois deviations from genuine Marxism in our ranks. If a student wishes to join our organization, we will say to them, "You are very welcome to join our organization, but only if you are willing to adopt the outlook and perspectives of the working class and dedicate yourself to the study of Marxism. Please leave your prejudices by the door." Marx wrote in a letter to Engels, September 17 to 18, 1879, If people of this kind from other classes join the proletarian movement, the first condition must be that they should not bring any remnants of bourgeois, petty bourgeois, etc. prejudices with them, but should adopt wholeheartedly the proletarian outlook. The Trotskyist movement has had plenty of experience of this kind of thing in the past. It is sufficient to point to the example of the American SWP, which completely denigrated because they ignored Trotsky's excellent advice from the 1930s. They became swamped in the student milieu, abandoned the class standpoint, and adopted all the trendy, petty bourgeois ideas, feminism, black nationalism, etc., ending up with the lamentable condition they now find themselves in. We must educate the whole organization on these questions in order to guarantee that no such development takes place within the IMT. We cannot tolerate even the slightest concession, even the smallest vestige of this in our ranks. To allow such petty bourgeois ideas into the organization would lead to its eventual destruction as a genuine revolutionary Marxist force capable of winning the working class to the cause of socialist revolution. Lenin, like Engels, Marx, and Trotsky, never minced words when attacking alien ideas, particularly those of the radical petty bourgeoisie. We should republish what Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, and Clara Zetkin wrote on the question of feminism. They are very clear in this respect. We must openly state our opposition to intersectionality and other variants of, quote, identity politics, which clearly represents a counter-revolutionary tendency to divide the movement. On this question, there is no room for ambiguity. We should express ourselves in the clearest and most emphatic manner. We want to recruit students, but they must be students who are prepared to break radically with petty bourgeois ideas and to place themselves firmly on the standpoint of the working class. Student comrades must face towards the working class, towards the factories and workers' housing estates, toward the trade unions and the labor movement. Every student comrade should set him or herself the target of winning at least young one worker to the organization. In November 1932, Trotsky wrote, "The revolutionary student can only make a contribution if, in the first place, he goes through a rigorous and consistent process of revolutionary self-education, and in the second place, if he joins the revolutionary workers' movement while he is still a student. At the same time, let me make clear that when I talk about theoretical self-education, I mean the study of unfalsified Marxism." End quote. The way to proletarianize our student comrades is first and foremost to provide them with a thorough grounding in Marxist theory. Many students have a lot of confused ideas that they have imbibed on the rotten academic milieu. Our task is to correct those false ideas as soon as possible. This will not be done by a softly approach. Experience shows that the serious students, far from taking offense at straight talking, will respect you for it. Those who cannot take outspoken argument are not offended by our quote tone, but simply because they find it impossible to abandon their petty bourgeois ideas and prejudices. Frankly, we do not need that sort of person. We have succeeded in organizing and maintaining a solid and ideologically homogeneous organization. This is the result of decades of strict Marxist ideological training of our basic cadres. However, small mistakes in method, erroneous slogans, and formulations can develop into more serious problems. As Lenin put it, quote, "A single scratch can cause gangrene," end quote. We must make use of polemics to raise the political level and understanding in order to build the international on solid foundations. Decades of economic growth in the advanced capitalist countries gave rise to an unprecedented generation of the mass organizations of the working class. This isolated the revolutionary current, which everywhere was reduced to a small minority. Out of necessity, we have learned to swim against the stream. However, this clarifying of our basic ideas, methods, and traditions was not achieved easily or without a struggle. It was manifested in a series of splits. Far from weakening the RCI, this process of selection has enormously strengthened us. The prior condition for future success was to break radically from opportunist and revisionist tendencies. As Lenin explained, before we can unite, and in order that we may unite, we must first draw firm and definite lines of demarcation. Alone on the left, the RCI has a serious attitude to Marxist theory. The theoretical training of the cadres is one of our most fundamental and urgent tasks. This is the foundation upon which we will build a powerful Marxist tendency rooted in the working class. So this has been Marxism and Identity Politics. And normally I try to read for 30 minutes and then sit and meditate for 30 minutes, but this has taken about an hour to finish this pamphlet today, and my voice did not give out. I felt strong to read, so I just read the whole thing. So we're going to jump right now into the yoga instead of sitting, because I've been sitting while I've been reading. And I have about an hour before the Tallahassee RCA University meeting. So we will move on. And I'm going to put on an audiobook by Lenin while we switch to the yoga practice. Okay.
Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the July 2022 edition of Socialism for All. It's an audiobook and discussion of Corrupting the Workers with Refined Nationalism by Lenin from 1914. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this piece was first published in Put Pravdy number 82, May 10, 1914, signed V.I., published according to the text in Put Pravdy. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1972, Moscow, Volume 20, translated by Bernard Isaacs and the late Joe Feinberg, HTML transcription and markup by Arsen Bala, and it's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive, marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. Please go check them out. So let's get into the audiobook. The more strongly the working class movement develops, the more frantic are the attempts by the bourgeoisie and the feudalists to suppress it or break it up. Both these methods, suppression by force and disintegration by bourgeois influence, are constantly employed all over the world, in all countries, and one or another of these methods is adopted alternately by the different parties of the ruling classes. In Russia, particularly after 1905, when the more intelligent members of the bourgeoisie realized that brute force alone was ineffective, all sorts of, quote, progressive bourgeois parties and groups have been more and more resorting to the method of dividing the workers by advocating different bourgeois ideas and doctrines designed to weaken the struggle of the working class. 1905 was, of course, the first Russian Revolution. One such idea is refined nationalism, which advocates the division and splitting up of the proletariat on the most plausible and specious pretexts, as, for example, that of protecting the interests of, quote, national culture, quote, national autonomy, or national independence, and so on and so forth. The class-conscious workers fight hard against every kind of nationalism, both the crude, violent, Black Hundred nationalism, and that most refined nationalism, which preaches the equality of nations together with the splitting up of the workers' cause, the workers' organizations, and the working class movement according to nationality. In other words, breaking up the working class movement so it's not purely international but along national lines. Unlike all the varieties of the nationalist bourgeoisie, class-conscious workers, carrying out the decisions of the recent summer 1913 Conference of the Marxists, stand not only for the most complete, consistent, and fully applied equality of nations and languages, but also for the amalgamation of the workers of the different nationalities in united proletarian organizations of every kind. Herein lies the fundamental distinction between the national program of Marxism and that of any bourgeoisie, be it the most, quote, advanced. Recognition of the equality of nations and languages is important to Marxists, not only because they're the most consistent Democrats. The interests of proletarian solidarity and comradely unity in the workers' class struggle call for the fullest equality of nations with a view to removing every trace of national distrust, estrangement, suspicion, and enmity. And full equality implies the repudiation of all privileges for any one language, and the recognition of the right of self-determination for all nations. To the bourgeoisie, however, the demand for national equality very often amounts in practice to advocating national exclusiveness and chauvinism. They very often couple it with advocacy of the division and estrangement of nations. This is absolutely incompatible with proletarian internationalism, which advocates not only closer relations between nations, but the amalgamation of the workers of all nationalities in a given state in united proletarian organizations. That is why Marxists emphatically condemn so-called cultural national autonomy, i.e., the idea that educational affairs should be taken out of the hands of the state and transferred to the respective nationalities. This plan means that in questions of, quote, national culture, educational affairs are to be split up in national associations, according to the nationalities in the given state federation, each with its own separate diet, educational budgets, school boards, and educational institutions. This is a plan of refined nationalism, which corrupts and divides the working class. To this plan of the Bundists, liquidators, and narodniks, i.e. of the various petty bourgeois groups, the Marxists contrapose the principle of complete equality of nations and languages, and go to the extent of denying the necessity of an official language. At the same time, they advocate the closest possible relations between the nations, uniform state institutions for all nations, uniform school boards, a uniform education policy, secular education, and the unity of the workers of the different nations in the struggle against the nationalism of every national bourgeoisie, a nationalism which is presented in the form of the slogan, national culture, for the purpose of deceiving simpletons. Let the petty bourgeois nationalists, the Bundists, the liquidators, the Narodniks, and the writers for Zvin openly advocate their principle of refined bourgeois nationalism. That is their right. But they should not try to fool the workers, as Madame V.O. does, for example, in issue number 35 of Severnaya Robochia Gazeta, where she assures her readers that Za Pravdu is opposed to instruction in schools being given in the native languages. Footnote there, V.O. was the author of the article The Deterioration of School Education, published in Severnaya Robochia Gazeta, March 21st, 1914. Back to the text. That is gross slander. The Pravdists not only recognize this right, but are more consistent in recognizing it than anyone else. The Pravdists, who identified themselves with the Conference of Marxists, which declared that no compulsory official language was necessary, were the first in Russia to recognize fully the right to use the native language. It is crass ignorance to confuse instruction in the native language with, quote, dividing educational affairs within a single state according to nationality, with cultural national autonomy, with taking educational affairs out of the hands of the state. Nowhere in the world are Marxists, or even Democrats, opposed to instruction being conducted in the native language. And nowhere in the world have Marxists adopted the program of cultural national autonomy. Austria is the only country in which it was even proposed. The example of Finland, as quoted by Madame V.O., is an argument against herself, for in that country, the equality of nations and languages, which we recognize unreservedly and more consistently than anybody, is recognized and carried out, but there is no question there about taking educational affairs out of the hands of the state, about separate national associations to deal with all educational affairs, about partitioning up the school system of a country with national barriers and so forth. And that's the end of the audiobook. A short one this time, impassioned but brief. I am trying to incorporate into the channel a number of texts about nationalism and war. These are pretty important points for people to understand if you're trying to become a Marxist-Leninist and understand, what did Lenin, for example, think about these things? What was the position of the Bolsheviks, etc.? Because there are so many people today trying to corrupt the name of Marxism, just as really in every point in history, but especially during times of crisis for capitalism. The bourgeois come along with their people and they try to introduce all kinds of ideas, exactly as Lenin is saying, to corrupt the workers with refined nationalism. Reading that first line again, the more strongly the working class movement develops, the more frantic are the attempts by the bourgeoisie and the feudalists, even stronger reactionaries than the capitalists, to suppress it or break it up. And then they realize that brute force is not entirely possible. So what's easier for them is to put out so many confusing ideas, trying to be a learning Marxist in that environment. It's like you're in a hall of mirrors. And this is the case today. We see people advocating all kinds of right-wing ideas under the name of Marxism, socialism, communism, and we have to reject that. And the easiest way to do that is read the source. Know the history. This is a great guideline as you become class conscious and you start to learn how to reason through these things yourself, applying class analysis to various situations that crop up as you're trying to interpret politics and the struggles that occur in your daily life. Well, there are some positive examples to look back on. Lenin is certainly one of them, and that's what we're trying to make accessible here at Socialism for All. So anyway, what do you Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file's being Socialism for All. This file's being recorded for the August 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of The European War and International Socialism by Lenin from 1914. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this piece was written in late August to September 1914, first published on August 1st, 1929 in Pravda number 174, published according to the manuscript. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1974, Moscow, Volume 21. HTML transcription and markup by D. Walters and R. Simbala, and it's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive, within the Marxists Internet Archive, marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this file and thousands of other free Marxist texts. Let's get into it. To the socialist, it is not the horrors of war that are the hardest to endure. We are always for a holy war of all the oppressed, for the conquest of their own fatherland, as the saying goes. But the horrors of the treachery shown by the leaders of present-day socialism, the horrors of the collapse of the present-day international. Is it not treachery to socialism when we see the German socialists' amazing change of front after Germany's declaration of war? The false phrases about a war of liberation against Tsarism, forgetfulness of German imperialism, forgetfulness of the rape of Serbia, the bourgeois interests involved in the war against Britain, etc., etc. Chauvinist patriots vote for the war budget. Have the socialists of France and Belgium not shown the same kind of treachery? They're excellent at exposing German imperialism, but unfortunately they're amazingly purblind with regard to British, French, and particularly the barbarous Russian imperialism. They fail to see the disgraceful fact that for decades on end, the French bourgeoisie have been paying out thousands of millions for the hire of the Black Hundred reactionary gangs of Russian Tsarism, and that the latter has been crushing the non-Russian majority in our country, robbing Poland, oppressing the great Russian workers and peasants, and so on. At such a time, the socialist feels refreshed when he reads of the bitter truth so courageously and straightforwardly told by Avanti to Südicum, the truth that paper told the German socialists, namely that they are imperialists, i.e. chauvinists. One feels even more refreshed on reading the article by Zabordi, exposing not only the German and the Austrian brands of chauvinism, which is to the advantage of the Italian bourgeoisie, but also the French, an article which shows that this war is a war of the bourgeoisie of all lands. Avanti's stand and the Zabordi article, as well as the resolution of the group of revolutionary Marxists at a recent conference in a Scandinavian country, shows us what is right and what is wrong in the usual phrase about the collapse of the international. This phrase is reiterated with malicious relish by the bourgeois and the opportunists, the riformisti di destra, reformists of the right, and with bitterness by socialists, Volksrecht and Zurich, and Bremer Bürger Zeitung, two socialist dailies. There is a great deal of truth in the phrase. The downfall of the leaders and of most of the parties in the present-day international, the Second International, is a fact. Compare Vorwärts, Wiener Arbeiter Zeitung, and Hamburger Echo versus L'Humanité, and the appeals of the Belgian and the French socialists versus the, quote, reply of the German Vorstand. The masses have not yet spoken out. Quick comment here, there are a number of footnotes about each of these papers and sort of what their political trajectory was within the socialist movement. I encourage you to click the link in the video description to the text and then read through those if you're not familiar with them. Continuing. However, Zabordi is 1,000 times right in saying that it is not a matter of theory being wrong or of the remedy of socialism being wrong, but simply of its not being available in sufficient doses, and of certain socialists not being sufficiently socialist. In other words, socialist theory is correct, but people are not following through. It is not socialism that has collapsed in the shape of the present-day European international, but an insufficient socialism, i.e., opportunism and reformism. It is this, quote, tendency, which exists everywhere in all countries, and has found such vivid expression in Bisolati and Company in Italy, that has collapsed, for it has for years been teaching forgetfulness of the class struggle, etc., from the resolution. Lenin is here referring to the resolution adopted by the Bolshevik group at its meeting in Bern, August 24 to 26, 1914. Zabordi is right when he sees the European socialists' main guilt in their attempts to backdate their justification with plausible excuses, both of their inability to prevent the carnage and their need to take part in the latter. They prefer to create the semblance of doing voluntarily, European socialism, what they are forced to do of necessity, that the socialists have lined up with their own particular nation, with the latter's bourgeois government, in a measure capable of engendering disappointment in us, also in all socialists who are not opportunists, and delight all non-socialists in Italy. And of course not of Italy alone, but of all countries, for example, Russian liberalism. Even given the total incapacity and impotence of the European socialists, the behavior of their leaders reveals treachery and baseness. The workers have been driven into the slaughter, while the leaders vote in favor and join governments. Even with their total impotence, they should have voted against, should not have joined their governments and uttered chauvinistic infamies, should not have shown solidarity with their, quote, nation, and should not have defended their, quote, own bourgeoisie. They should have unmasked its vileness. Everywhere there is the bourgeoisie and the imperialists. Everywhere the ignoble preparations for carnage. If Russian Tsarism is particularly infamous and barbarous and more reactionary than all the rest, then German imperialism, too, is monarchist. Its aims are feudal and dynastic, and its gross bourgeoisie are less free than the French. The Russian Marxists were right in saying that to them, the defeat of Tsarism was the lesser evil, for their immediate enemy was, first and foremost, great Russian chauvinism, but that in each country, the socialists, who are not opportunists, ought to see their main enemy in their own, quote-unquote, homemade chauvinism. Is it true, however, that the incapacity is so very absolute? Is that so? Shot down, Heldentot, and a miserable death? And all this for the sake of another country? Not always. The initiative was possible, and even obligatory. Illegal propaganda and civil war would be more honest and obligatory for socialists. This is what the Russian socialists are calling for. For instance, they take comfort in the illusion that the war will end and things will settle down. But no, for the collapse of the present day, 1889 to 19 international, not to turn into the collapse of socialism, for the masses not to turn away, and to prevent the domination of anarchism and syndicalism, just as shamefully as in France, the truth must be looked in the face. Whoever wins, Europe is threatened by the growth of chauvinism, by revenge-seeking, etc. Militarism, whether German or Great Russian, fosters counter-chauvinism, and the like. It is our duty to draw the conclusion of the complete collapse of the opportunism, the reformism, so impressively proclaimed in Italy, and so decisively rejected by the Italian comrades. So the manuscript breaks off here. That's not probably supposed to be the end of the text, but it is the actual end of the text. However, there's a footnote and some marginal notes. Ever since its foundation in 1892, a sharp ideological struggle was conducted in the Italian Socialist Party between the opportunist and the revolutionary wings, which differed on the question of the party's policy and tactics. Under pressure from the lefts, the most outspoken reformists, Bonomi and Bisalati, who supported the war and advocated collaboration with the government and the bourgeoisie, were expelled from the party at its Congress in Reggio Emilia in 1982. After the outbreak of the war, of course World War I, in case you're really lost, and before Italy's entry into it, the party took an anti-war stand under the slogan, "Against the war, for neutrality." In December 1914, the party expelled a group of renegades, Mussolini and others, who defended the imperialist policy of the bourgeoisie and favored Italy's participation in the war. Comment there, Mussolini, less than 3 years later, in 1917, would be hired by the British intelligence service MI5 and paid a salary to begin his new direction, shall we say. Continuing, the Italian socialists met in a joint conference with the Swiss socialists at Lugano, 1914, and took an active part in the international socialist conferences in Zimmerwald, 1915, and Kiental, 1916. On the whole, however, the Italian Socialist Party followed a centrist policy. With Italy's entry into the war in May 1915, the party renounced its anti-war stand and issued a slogan, "Neither participate in the war nor sabotage it," which in practice meant support for the war. So as far as the marginal notes, Lenin had written that the contemptuous and scornful attitude of Die Neuzeit toward the Italian socialists and Avanti amounted to petty concessions to opportunism, the golden mean. Finally, the so-called center equal the lackeys of the opportunists. So, that's the end of the text. Lenin wrote a lot about World War I and the collapse of the Second International due to opportunism, specifically opportunism that came to a head in the endorsing of the bourgeois imperialist war, World War I. Prior to the war, the various socialist parties that were participating in the International had basically agreed that should war break out, which was looking more and more likely, that they would tell their membership and the working class of Europe generally not to support the war, but to turn the war between the bourgeoisie into war against the bourgeoisie. In other words, when the bourgeoisie and the capitalist governments of Europe tell you, the working class, hey, pick up a gun and go shoot at some worker from another country for us so that we can solidify our system and hammer out our inner capitalist squabbles, don't do it. Don't shoot at other workers, but instead realize your collective strength, turn on the bourgeoisie, shut the whole thing down, and have a revolution. Catch them when their pants are down. During this vulnerable time of crisis for all the bourgeoisies of Europe, hit them, strike. What are you waiting for? That's the perfect opportunity. You get what you want and what you've been organizing for, and you avoid doing the horrific thing that they're instructing you to do. Why would you endorse that? Well, a lot of the parties involved in the Socialist International did that. Lenin was furious, wrote a lot about it, especially against Karl Kautsky, who was kind of the ringleader of a lot of this. If you look at works like The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, The Collapse of the Second International, Opportunism and the Collapse of the Second International, and many other works, Lenin wrote about this extensively. Marxism-Leninism could not be clearer when it comes to the working class not supporting imperialist war. That is, war of capitalists in the era of highly advanced capitalism. Sometimes inexperienced Marxists attempt to do analysis and get confused, for example, by the history of China, where the Chinese Communist Party allied with the Kuomintang, the bourgeois nationalist faction, in the early 20th century after the Qing dynasty collapsed. So in the decades just after Chinese feudalism collapsed, Chinese capitalism was not highly developed. It was not imperialism at that time. In fact, they were fending off Japanese imperialism. So the Chinese bourgeoisie, Chinese capitalism generally, was not well developed. It had not advanced to the stage of monopoly capitalism. It was still in the early stages where the bourgeoisie, as Lenin writes in other places, is still fighting alongside the working classes. In that sense, in early capitalism, as feudalism is being overthrown and the bourgeois nation state is being developed and set up, then capitalism is fulfilling its progressive role in historical development. And socialists share many of the same interests. The problem is, once the capitalists do attain power, sort of get the nation state set up and get their class exploitation, capitalism, rolling along, then their whole existence and wealth depends on the exploitation of the working class, and all this sort of freedom fighting comes to a halt. The talk of equality and freedom was good for them when they were setting up the nation, but don't go too far, or else the bourgeoisie is going to get overthrown. That's what they realize. And then at that point, the class-conscious proletariat, capitalism has fulfilled its purpose at this point, needs to organize and turn against the bourgeoisie. So the stage of historical development in terms of feudalism to capitalism to socialism, and even which stage of capitalism, the rising stage or the imperialist stage, that matters in doing this analysis. It really matters. So where are we in 2022? Are we still in the rising stage of capitalism in Europe and Russia, etc.? No, we are not. That has been left long behind. In fact, Russia used to be in a higher stage of development, used to be the premier socialist federation on earth. And unfortunately, it succumbed to counter-revolution and it went backwards a few steps back into capitalism. That's where it is now. The current leadership of Russia has designs on basically recreating the Tsarist Empire. It is extremely counter-revolutionary and is imperialist. It is not the, sort of Wild West, just setting up capitalism, ascendant nation state type of situation. Again, it went through all that, went on even into socialism, was approaching communism, and reverted back into highly organized, advanced imperial capitalism, because that is the highest stage of capitalism. That's what it is, imperialism. So it's only been at that in the case of Russia for about 30 years. So to compare it to something like the United States and its EU allies, Russia has, comparatively much less blood on its hands largely just as a consequence of time. Because I say 30 years, it's been a little bit over 30 years since the destruction of the USSR. But Russia, the former USSR, was in chaos for most of the 90s. So really, it's kind of only been at this for about 20 years. It's still a baby in that sense. It's a baby imperialist power. But make no mistake, there is not some other mode of production that they're following. It's capitalism. It's advanced capitalism, imperialism. So as of March 2022, per a YouGov poll, in the United States, a majority of the population, 57%, still thinks that Russia is socialist or communist. Only about 10 or 11% identify it as capitalist. That is how screwed up people are on the state of things in the world, and nobody knows anything. So as we hurtle towards possibly World War III, which, as far as a quote, multipolar capitalist world, that's really what you get. Either the capitalists work out their disputes peacefully, or they have giant wars. And giant wars is probably the likely outcome. Well, in this world, it's incumbent on Marxists to straighten people out in terms of their understanding. Yes, we're up against the bourgeois media putting out their messaging. We're up against all kinds of bizarre opportunists putting out their messaging. But we have to be clear in our program of educating the working class from a Marxist-Leninist standpoint, especially looking back at what was such a pivotal event, World War I, the collapse of the Second International, which led to the establishment of the Third Communist International, or the Comintern. Second International was so corrupt and broken. Basically, the successful socialists just scrapped it, moved on, made a Third International. And the Third International was unfortunately disbanded in World War II. And today we find ourselves again, the socialist movement largely having fallen into revisionism and facing massive global capitalist crisis. I believe that Marxism-Leninism can deliver us from this situation, can point us in the direction of a way out, but it's going to take a lot of building. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful and have allowed me to spend a lot more time creating content for this channel than I would have been able to do otherwise. Then after the content is created, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, comment, all of that stuff helps YouTube to recommend this content to additional people and keep the audience growing. We've been seeing that growth, and again, we really need it. This is a serious time of crisis for capitalism, and the US left, where I am, really could stand some improvement. Baseline education, we're here to help with that. Thanks again, and we'll catch you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2022 edition of Socialism for All. And it's an audiobook and discussion of the tasks of revolutionary social democracy, aka Marxism, in the European war. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this piece was written not later than August 24, 1914. We'll have a footnote about the background of the text in just a minute. As far as publication, the introduction, The Russian Social Democrats on the European War, is published for the first time. The theses, the resolution, were first published in full in 1929 in the second and third editions of the works of V.I. Lenin, Volume 18. The introduction is published according to the manuscript, the theses, resolution, according to a copy made by N.K. Kripskaya. Source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1974, Moscow, Volume 21. HTML transcription and markup by D. Walters and R. Simbala, and it's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive, marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. So as far as that footnote, these theses on the war were drawn up by Lenin not later than August 24, 1914, after he had come to Bern from Poranin, Galicia. They were discussed at a meeting of the Bolshevik group in Bern on August 24 to 26. Approved by the group, the theses were circulated among the Bolshevik groups abroad. To throw the police off the scent, A copy of the theses made out by N.K. Krupskaya carried the inscription, "Copy of the Manifesto issued in Denmark." The theses were smuggled into Russia for discussion by the Russian section of the Central Committee, party organizations, and the Bolshevik Duma parliament group. Through Swiss Social Democrats, the theses were submitted to the Conference of the Swiss and Italian Socialists held in Lugano on September 27, 1914. Many of the ideas contained in the theses were incorporated in the conference's resolution. On learning of the approval of the theses in Russia, Lenin used them as a basis for writing the manifesto of the RSDLP Central Committee, the War and Russian Social Democracy. The introduction to the theses, which was written on a separate sheet, was discovered only later and was first published in the fourth Russian edition of Lenin's collected works. That's the end of the footnote. Thanks to MIA for including that background. Let's get into the text. Reports have reached us from most reliable sources regarding a conference recently held by leaders of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party on the question of the European war. The conference was not of a wholly official nature, since the Central Committee of the RSDLP has as yet been unable to gather as a result of the numerous arrests and unprecedented persecution by the Tsarist government. We do, however, have precise information that the conference gave expression to views held by the most influential circles of the RSDLP. The conference adopted the following resolution, whose full text we're quoting below as a document. Resolution of a group of social democrats. And again, just commenting, social democracy was the term for Marxism in these years. 1. The European and World War has the clearly defined character of a bourgeois, imperialist, and dynastic war. A struggle for markets and for freedom to loot foreign countries, a striving to suppress the revolutionary movement of the proletariat and democracy in the individual countries, a desire to deceive, disunite, and slaughter the proletarians of all countries by setting the wage slaves of one nation against those of another, so as to benefit the bourgeoisie. These are the only real content and significance of the war. 2. The conduct of the leaders of the German Social Democratic Party, the strongest and the most influential in the Second International, 1889 to 1914, a party which has voted for war credits and repeated the bourgeois chauvinist phrases of the Prussian Junkers and the bourgeoisie, is sheer betrayal of socialism. Under no circumstances can the conduct of the leaders of the German Social Democratic Party be condoned, even if we assume that the party was absolutely weak and had temporarily to bow to the will of the bourgeois majority of the nation. This party has in fact adopted a national liberal policy. 3. The conduct of the Belgian and French Social Democratic Party leaders who have betrayed socialism by entering bourgeois governments is just as reprehensible. Footnote there, among those who joined the bourgeois government of Belgium was Vanderbilt, and in France, Jules Guesde, Marcel Sambat, and Albert Thomas. Point 4. The betrayal of socialism by most leaders of the Second International signifies the ideological and political bankruptcy of the International. This collapse has been mainly caused by the actual prevalence in it of petty bourgeois opportunism, the bourgeois nature and the danger of which have long been indicated by the finest representatives of the revolutionary proletariat of all countries. The opportunists had long been preparing to wreck the Second International by denying the socialist revolution and substituting bourgeois reformism in its stead, by rejecting the class struggle with its inevitable conversion at certain moments into civil war, and by preaching class collaboration, by preaching bourgeois chauvinism under the guise of patriotism and the defense of the fatherland, and ignoring or rejecting the fundamental truth of socialism, long ago set forth in the Communist Manifesto, that the working people have no country, by confining themselves in the struggle against militarism to a sentimental Philistine point of view, instead of recognizing the need for a revolutionary war by the proletarians of all countries against the bourgeoisie of all countries, by making a fetish of the necessary utilization of bourgeois parliamentarism and bourgeois legality, and forgetting that illegal forms of organization and agitation are imperative at times of crises. One of the organs of international opportunism, Sozialistische Monatschefte, which has long taken a national liberal stand, is very properly celebrating its victory over European socialism. The so-called center of the German and other Marxist parties has in actual fact faint-heartedly capitulated to the opportunists. It must be the task of the future international, resolutely and irrevocably, to rid itself of this bourgeois trend in socialism. Comment, they would eventually do that with the establishment of the Third Communist International, or the Comintern, but first they had to get through World War I and the Russian Revolution. Anyway, there's a footnote. Sozialistische Monatshefte, or Socialist Monthly, was the principal organ of the German opportunists, and one of the organs of international opportunism. It was published in Berlin from 1897 to 1933. During the First World War, it took a social chauvinist stand. Back to the text. Point 5. With reference to the bourgeois and chauvinist sophisms being used by the bourgeois parties and the governments of the two chief rival nations of the continent, the German and the French, to fool the masses most effectively, and being copied by both the overt and covert socialist opportunists who are slavishly following in the wake of the bourgeoisie, one must particularly note and brand the following. When the German bourgeois refer to the defense of the fatherland and to the struggle against Tsarism, and insist on the freedom of cultural and national development, they are lying, because it has always been the policy of Prussian Junkerdom, headed by Wilhelm II and the big bourgeoisie of Germany, to defend the Tsarist monarchy. Whatever the outcome of the war, they're sure to try to bolster it. They're lying because, in actual fact, the Austrian bourgeoisie have launched a robber campaign against Serbia, and the German bourgeoisie are oppressing Danes, Poles, and Frenchmen in Alsace-Lorraine. They are waging a war of aggression against Belgium and France so as to loot the richer and freer countries. They've organized an offensive at a moment which seemed best for the use of the latest improvements in military materiel and on the eve of the introduction of the so-called big military program in Russia. Similarly, when the French bourgeois refer to the defense of the fatherland, etc., they are lying, because in actual fact, they're defending countries that are backward in capitalist technology and are developing more slowly, and because they spend thousands of millions to hire Russian Tsardom's Black Hundred gangs for a war of aggression, i.e. the looting of Austrian and German lands. Footnote there, the Black Hundreds were monarchist gangs, extreme reactionaries, formed by the Tsarist police to fight the revolutionary movement. They murdered revolutionaries, assaulted progressive intellectuals, and organized pogroms. So roughly the equivalent today of the various right-wing vigilante groups that we see forming and targeting Antifa, etc. Neither of the two belligerent groups of nations is second to the other in cruelty and atrocities in warfare, i.e. they're both equal. Point 6, it is the first and foremost task of Russian Social Democrats to wage a ruthless and all-out struggle against Great Russian and Tsarist monarchist chauvinism, and against the sophisms used by the Russian liberals, cadets, a section of the Narodniks, populists, and other bourgeois parties in defense of that chauvinism. From the viewpoint of the working class and the toiling masses of all the peoples of Russia, the defeat of the Tsarist monarchy and its army, which oppressed Poland, the Ukraine, and many other peoples of Russia, and foment hatred among the people so as to increase Great Russian oppression of the other nationalities and consolidate the reactionary and barbarous government of the Tsar's monarchy, would be the lesser evil by far. 7. The following must now be the slogans of social democracy. First, all-embracing propaganda involving the army and the theater of hostilities as well, for the socialist revolution and the need to use weapons, not against their brothers, the wage slaves in other countries, but against the reactionary and bourgeois governments and parties of all countries. The urgent necessity of organizing illegal nuclei and groups in the armies of all nations to conduct such propaganda in all languages. A merciless struggle against the chauvinism and, quote, patriotism of the Philistines and bourgeoisie of all countries without exception. Of all countries without exception. In the struggle against the leaders of the present international who have betrayed socialism, it is imperative to appeal to the revolutionary consciousness of the working masses, who bear the entire burden of the war and are in most cases hostile to opportunism and chauvinism. Secondly, as an immediate slogan, propaganda for republics in Germany, Poland, Russia, and other countries, and for the transforming of all the separate states of Europe into a Republican United States of Europe. Footnote here, for more on that, see Lenin's articles on the slogan for United States of Europe and on the slogan for United States of Europe, editorial comment by Social Democrat on the Manifesto on War, issued by the Central Committee of the RSDLP. Thirdly, and particularly, a struggle against the Tsarist monarchy and Great Russian pan-Slavist chauvinism, and advocacy of a revolution in Russia, as well as of the liberation of and self-determination for nationalities oppressed by Russia, coupled with the immediate slogans of a democratic republic, confiscation of the landed estates, and an 8-hour working day. Signed, a group of Social Democrats, members of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. So that's the end of the text. There's one footnote I skipped, actually, on the Cadets, major Russian political party at this time. The Cadets were members of the Constitutional Democratic Party, the leading party of the liberal monarchist bourgeoisie in Russia. Founded in 1905, the party represented the bourgeoisie, zemstvo, landowner leaders, and bourgeois intellectuals. Prominent among its members were Milyukov, Muromtsev, Maklakov, Shingaryov, Struve, and Radachev. The Cadets were active in Russia's war preparations. They stood solidly behind the Tsarist government's predatory designs, hoping to batten on war contracts, strengthen the bourgeoisie's positions, and suppress the revolutionary movement in the country. With the outbreak of the war, the Cadets advanced the slogan of "War to the victorious end." When, in 1915, the Tsarist forces suffered a defeat at the front, which led to the aggravation of the revolutionary crisis inside Russia, the Cadet members of the State Duma, parliament, headed by Milyukov and the other representatives of the bourgeoisie and the landowners, formed a progressist bloc aimed at checking the revolution, preserving the monarchy, and bringing the war to a, quote, victorious end. The Cadets actively helped to set up war industries committees. So, that's the end of the footnote. This is what Lenin and the Bolsheviks were fighting against. Are there organizations and a movement capable of doing this again today, as tensions toward an apparent World War III begin to reveal themselves? And if not, are we capable of creating one? Food for thought. Anyway, I'm going to leave it here. Thanks for listening. Thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen and whose support helps me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I'd be able to do without that support. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment. All of that helps YouTube to recommend this content to more people. So sharing it on your social media is great, but also that other engagement is helping YouTube to share it on your behalf. So the audience has been expanding. We want to see it keep expanding because everybody, I think, needs to relearn a lot of these lessons. All right, thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of The War and Russian Social Democracy by Lenin from 1914. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. You can find a link to Patreon in the video description. So this piece was written prior to September 28, 1914, published on November 1st, 1914, in Sozialdemokrat number 33, published according to the newspaper text, checked against the manuscript. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1974, Moscow, Volume 21. HTML transcription and markup by D. Walters and R. Cimbala, and it's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive, marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. So let's get into the audiobook. The European War, of course referring to World War I, which the governments and the bourgeois parties of all countries have been preparing for decades, has broken out. The growth of armaments, the extreme intensification of the struggle for markets in the latest, the imperialist stage of capitalist development in the advanced countries, and the dynastic interests of the more backward East European monarchies were inevitably bound to bring about this war, and have done so. The seizure of territory and subjugation of other nations, the ruining of competing nations, and the plunder of their wealth, distracting the attention of the working masses from internal political crises in Russia, Germany, Britain, and other countries, disuniting and nationalist stultification of the workers, and the extermination of their vanguard, so as to weaken the revolutionary movement of the proletariat. These comprise the sole actual content, importance, and significance of the present war. It is primarily on social democracy, in those days that was just the general term for Marxism, that the duty rests of revealing the true meaning of the war and of ruthlessly exposing the falsehood, sophistry, and, quote, patriotic phrase-mongering spread by the ruling classes, the landowners, and the bourgeoisie in defense of the war. One group of belligerent nations is headed by the German bourgeoisie. It is hoodwinking the working class and the toiling masses by asserting that this is a war in defense of the fatherland, freedom and civilization, for the liberation of the peoples oppressed by Tsarism, and for the destruction of reactionary Tsarism. In actual fact, however, this bourgeoisie, which servilely grovels to the Prussian Junkers, headed by Wilhelm II, has always been a most faithful ally of Tsarism and an enemy of the revolutionary movement of Russia's workers and peasants. In fact, whatever the outcome of the war, this bourgeoisie will, together with the Junkers, exert every effort to support the Tsarist monarchy against a revolution in Russia. In fact, the German bourgeoisie has launched a robber campaign against Serbia, the object of subjugating her and throttling the national revolution of the southern Slavs, at the same time sending the bulk of its military forces against the freer countries, Belgium and France, so as to plunder richer competitors. In fact, the German bourgeoisie, which has been spreading the fable that it's waging a war of defense, chose the moment it thought most favorable for war, making use of its latest improvements in military materiel and forestalling the rearmament already planned and decided upon by Russia and France. The other group of belligerent nations is headed by the British and the French bourgeoisie, who are hoodwinking the working class and the toiling masses by asserting that they're waging a war for the defense of their countries, for freedom and civilization, and against German militarism and despotism. In actual fact, this bourgeoisie has long been spending thousands of millions to hire the troops of Russian Tsarism, the most reactionary and barbarous monarchy in Europe, and prepare them for an attack on Germany. In fact, the struggle of the British and the French bourgeoisie is aimed at the seizure of the German colonies and the ruining of a rival nation, whose economic development has been more rapid than theirs. In pursuit of this noble aim, the, quote, advanced, quote, democratic nations are helping the savage Tsarist regime to still more throttle Poland, the Ukraine, etc., and more thoroughly crush the revolution in Russia. Neither group of belligerents is inferior to the other in spoliation, atrocities, and the boundless brutality of war. However, to hoodwink the proletariat and distract its attention from the only genuine war of liberation, namely a civil war against the bourgeoisie, both of its, quote, own and of, quote, foreign countries. To achieve so lofty an aim, the bourgeoisie of each country is trying, with the help of false phrases about patriotism, to extol the significance of its, quote, own national war, asserting that it is out to defeat the enemy, not for plunder and the seizure of territory, but for the, quote, liberation of all other peoples except its own. But the harder the governments and the bourgeoisie of all countries try to disunite the workers and pit them against one another, and the more savagely they enforce, for this lofty aim, martial law and the military censorship, measures which, even now in wartime, are applied against the, quote, internal foe more harshly than against the external, the more pressingly it is the duty of the class-conscious proletariat to defend its class solidarity, its internationalism, and its socialist convictions against the unbridled chauvinism of the, quote, patriotic bourgeois cliques in all countries. If class-conscious workers were to give up the same, this would mean renunciation of their aspirations for freedom and democracy, to say nothing of their socialist aspirations. It is with a feeling of the most bitter disappointment that we have to record that the socialist parties of the leading European countries have failed to discharge this duty. The behavior of these parties' leaders, particularly in Germany, bordering on downright betrayal of the cause of socialism. At this time of supreme and historic importance, most of the leaders of the present Socialist International, the Second International, 1889 to 1914, are trying to substitute nationalism for socialism. As a result of their behavior, the workers' parties of these countries did not oppose the government's criminal conduct, but instead called upon the working class to identify its position with that of the imperialist governments. The leaders of the International committed an act of treachery against socialism by voting for the war credits, by reiterating the chauvinist, quote, patriotic slogans of the bourgeoisie of their, quote, own countries, by justifying and defending the war, by joining the bourgeois governments of the belligerent countries, and so on and so forth. The most influential socialist leaders and the most influential organs of the socialist press of present-day Europe hold views that are chauvinist, bourgeois, and liberal, and in no way socialist. The responsibility for thus disgracing socialism falls primarily on the German Social Democrats, who were the strongest and most influential party in the Second International. But neither can one justify the French socialists, who've accepted ministerial posts in the government of that very bourgeoisie, which betrayed its country and allied itself with Bismarck so as to crush the commune. The German and Austrian Social Democrats are attempting to justify their support for the war by arguing that they are thereby fighting against Russian Tsarism. We Russian Social Democrats declare that we consider such justification sheer sophistry. In our country, the revolutionary movement against Tsarism has again assumed tremendous proportions during the past few years. This movement has always been headed by the working class of Russia. The political strikes of the last few years, which have involved millions of workers, have had as their slogan the overthrow of Tsarism and the establishment of a democratic republic. During his visit to Nicholas II on the very eve of the war, Poincaré, president of the French Republic, could see for himself in the streets of St. Petersburg barricades put up by Russian workers. The Russian proletariat has not flinched from any sacrifice to rid humanity of the disgrace of the Tsarist monarchy. We must, however, say that if there is anything that under certain conditions can delay the downfall of Tsarism, anything that can help Tsarism in its struggle against the whole of Russia's democracy, then that is the present war, which has placed the purses of the British, the French, and the Russian bourgeois at the disposal of Tsarism to further the latter's reactionary aims. If there is anything that can hinder the revolutionary struggle of Russia's working class against Tsarism, then that is the behavior of the German and the Austrian social democratic leaders, which the chauvinist press of Russia is continually holding up to us as an example. Even assuming that German social democracy was so weak that it was compelled to refrain from all revolutionary action, it should not have joined the chauvinist camp or taken steps which gave the Italian socialists reason to say that the German social democratic leaders were dishonoring the banner of the Proletarian International. Our party, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, has made and will continue to make great sacrifices in connection with the war. The whole of our working class legal press has been suppressed. Most working class associations have been disbanded, and a large number of our comrades have been arrested and exiled. Yet our parliamentary representatives, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Group in the Duma, considered it their imperative socialist duty not to vote for the war credits, and even to walk out of the Duma so as to express their protest the more energetically. They considered it their duty to brand the European government's policy as imperialist. Though the Tsar's government has increased its tyranny tenfold, the Social Democratic workers of Russia are already publishing their first illegal manifestos against the war, thus doing their duty to democracy and to the international. While the collapse of the Second International has given rise to a sense of burning shame in revolutionary social democrats, as represented by the minority of German social democrats and the finest social democrats in the neutral countries, while socialists in both Britain and France have been speaking up against the chauvinism of most social democratic parties, while the opportunists, as represented, for instance, by the German Sozialistische Monatshefte, which have long held a national liberal stand, are with good reason celebrating their victory over European socialism. The worst possible service is being rendered to the proletariat by those who vacillate between opportunism and revolutionary social democracy, like the, quote, center faction in the German Social Democratic Party, by those who are trying to hush up the collapse of the Second International or disguise it with diplomatic phrases. On the contrary, this collapse must be frankly recognized and its causes understood, so as to make it possible to build up a new and more lasting socialist unity of the workers of all countries. The opportunists have wrecked the decisions of the Stuttgart, Copenhagen, and Basel Congresses, which made it binding on socialists of all countries to combat chauvinism in any and all conditions, made it binding on socialists to reply to any war begun by the bourgeoisie and governments with intensified propaganda of civil war and social revolution. There's a footnote there. The Stuttgart Congress of the Second International was held on August 18 to 24, 1907. The RSDLP delegation consisted of 37 members, the Bolshevik delegates including Lenin, Lunacharsky, and Litvinov. Congress conducted its main work in committees set up to draft resolutions for the plenary meetings. Lenin worked on the committee which drafted a resolution on militarism and international conflicts. Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg introduced into Babel's draft the historic amendment on the duty of the socialists to use the war-created crisis to arouse the masses for the overthrow of capitalism. The amendment was adopted by the Congress. Concerning the Congress, see Lenin's articles, The International Socialist Congress in Stuttgart, in Volume 13. The Copenhagen Congress of the Second International was held between August 28 and September 3, 1910. The RSDLP being represented by Lenin, Plekhanov, Lunacharsky, Kollontai, Mokrovsky, and others. The Congress appointed several committees for preliminary discussion and drafting of resolutions on the agenda items. Lenin worked on the Cooperative Committee. The Congress's resolution, the struggle against militarism and war, confirmed the Stuttgart Congress's resolution on militarism and international conflicts, and listed the demands to be advanced by the socialist parliamentary deputies. A. All conflicts between states to be unfailingly submitted for settlement by international courts of arbitration. B. General disarmament. C. Abolition of secret diplomacy. D. Autonomy for all nations and the protection against military attacks and oppression. The Basel Congress of the Second International was held on November 24 to 25, 1912. It was the extraordinary Congress called in connection with the Balkan War and the imminent European War. The Congress adopted a manifesto emphasizing the imperialist nature of the approaching World War and called on the socialists of all countries to wage a vigorous struggle against war. We have a copy of the Basel Manifesto as an audiobook here at Socialism for All. Back to the text. The collapse of the Second International is the collapse of opportunism, which developed from the features of a now bygone and so-called peaceful period of history, and in recent years has come practically to dominate the international. The opportunists have long been preparing the ground for this collapse by denying the socialist revolution and substituting bourgeois reformism in its stead, by rejecting the class struggle with its inevitable conversion at certain moments into civil war, and by preaching class collaboration, by preaching bourgeois chauvinism under the guise of patriotism and the defense of the fatherland, and ignoring or rejecting the fundamental truth of socialism, long ago set forth in the Communist Manifesto, that the working men have no country, by confining themselves in the struggle against militarism to a sentimental Philistine point of view, instead of recognizing the need for a revolutionary war by the proletarians of all countries against the bourgeoisie of all countries, by making a fetish of the necessary utilization of bourgeois parliamentarism and bourgeois legality, and forgetting that illegal forms of organization and propaganda are imperative at times of crises. The natural, quote, appendage to opportunism, one that is just as bourgeois and hostile to the proletarian, i.e. the Marxist point of view, namely the anarcho-syndicalist trend, has been marked by a no less shamefully smug reiteration of the slogans of chauvinism during the present crisis. The aims of socialism at the present time cannot be fulfilled, and real international unity of the workers cannot be achieved without a decisive break from opportunism, and without explaining its inevitable fiasco to the masses. It must be the primary task of social democrats in every country to combat that country's chauvinism. In Russia, the chauvinism has overcome the bourgeois liberals, the, quote, constitutional democrats, and part of the narodniks, populists, down to the socialist revolutionaries and the right social democrats. In particular, the chauvinist utterances of E. Smirnov, P. Maslov, and G. Plekhanov, for example, should be branded. They have been taken up and widely used by the bourgeois, quote, patriotic press. In the present situation, it's impossible to determine, from the standpoint of the international proletariat, the defeat of which of the two groups of belligerent nations would be the lesser evil for socialism. But to us Russian social democrats, there cannot be the slightest doubt that from the standpoint of the working class and of the toiling masses of all the nations of Russia, the defeat of the Tsarist monarchy, the most reactionary and barbarous of governments, which is oppressing the largest number of nations and the greatest mass of the population of Europe and Asia, would be the lesser evil. The formation of a Republican United States of Europe should be the immediate political slogan of Europe's social democrats. In contrast with the bourgeoisie, which is ready to promise anything, in order to draw the proletariat into the mainstream of chauvinism. Boy, that sounds familiar. The Social Democrats will explain that this slogan is absolutely false and meaningless without the revolutionary overthrow of the German, the Austrian, and the Russian monarchies. Since Russia is most backward and has not yet completed its bourgeois revolution, it still remains the task of social democrats in that country to achieve the three fundamental conditions for consistent democratic reform. Get ready, a democratic republic with complete equality and self-determination for all nations, confiscation of the landed estates, and an 8-hour working day. But in all the advanced countries, the war has placed on the order of the day the slogan of socialist revolution, a slogan that is the more urgent, the more heavily the burden of war presses upon the shoulders of the proletariat, and the more active its future role must become in the recreation of Europe after the horrors of the present, quote, patriotic barbarism in conditions of the tremendous technological progress of large-scale capitalism. The bourgeoisie's use of wartime laws to gag the proletariat makes it imperative for the latter to create illegal forms of agitation and organization. Let the opportunists, quote, preserve the legal organizations at the price of treachery to their convictions. Revolutionary social democrats will utilize the organizational experience and links of the working class so as to create illegal forms of struggle for socialism, forms appropriate to a period of crisis, and to unite the workers, not with the chauvinist bourgeoisie of their respective countries, but with the workers of all countries. The Proletarian International has not gone under and will not go under. Notwithstanding all obstacles, the masses of the workers will create a new international. Opportunism's present triumph will be short-lived. The greater the sacrifices imposed by the war, the clearer will it become to the mass of the workers that the opportunists have betrayed the workers' cause, and that the weapons must be turned against the government and the bourgeoisie of each country. The conversion of the present imperialist war into a civil war is the only correct proletarian slogan, one that follows from the experience of the Commune and outlined in the Basel Resolution. It has been dictated by all the conditions of an imperialist war between highly developed bourgeois countries. However difficult that transformation may seem at any given moment, socialists will never relinquish systematic, persistent, and undeviating preparatory work in this direction now that war has become a fact. It is only along this path that the proletariat will be able to shake off its dependence on the chauvinist bourgeoisie, and in one form or another, and more or less rapidly, take decisive steps towards genuine freedom for the nations and towards socialism. Long live the international fraternity of the workers against the chauvinism and patriotism of the bourgeoisie of all countries. Long live a proletarian international, freed from opportunism. Signed, Central Committee of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. It's the end of the audiobook, but there is a footnote I skipped on the socialist revolutionaries listed among the parties that Lenin was having trouble with. This was a peasant-based party in Russia, founded at the end of 1901 and the beginning of 1902 as a result of the union of various Narodnik groups and circles, the Union of Socialist Revolutionaries, Socialist Revolutionary Party, etc. The newspaper Revolutionная Rossiya, Revolutionary Russia, ran from 1900 to 1905, and the journal Vestnik Russkoy Revolutsii, Herald of the Russian Revolution, ran from 1901 to 05, became its official organs. The socialist revolutionaries did not recognize the class differences between the proletariat and the petty proprietors. They glossed over the class contradictions within the peasantry and rejected the proletariat's leading role in the revolution. The socialist revolutionaries' views were an eclectic mixture of the ideas of narratism, that's old school peasant populism, and revisionism. They tried, as Lenin put it, to patch up, quote, the rents in the Narodnik ideas with bits of fashionable opportunist, quote, criticism of Marxism. This, to me, sounds exactly like today's populists. The Bolshevik Party exposed the socialist revolutionaries' attempts to masquerade as socialists, conducted a determined struggle against the socialist revolutionaries for influence over the peasantry, and showed how dangerous their tactic of individual terrorism was to the working class movement. At the same time, the Bolsheviks were prepared, on definite conditions, to enter into temporary agreements with the socialist revolutionaries in the struggle against Tsarism. As early as the First Russian Revolution, 1905 to 07, the right wing of the Socialist Revolutionary Party broke away and formed the legal Popular Socialist Party, whose outlook was close to that of the Cadets, the major bourgeois monarchist party. The left wing forming the semi-anarchist League of Maximalists. In the period of reaction between 1907 and 1910, the Socialist Revolutionary Party suffered a complete ideological and organizational breakdown. During the First World War, most of its members took a social chauvinist position. All right, so that's the end of the text and the footnotes. I like this one. Lenin did a lot of writing like this about World War I, and I think that it was doing this kind of work that helped keep together the Bolsheviks focused so that they were able to kind of pull through this relatively unscathed and lead the Russian Revolution in 1917. There were two revolutions in 1917. The February Revolution deposed the Tsar and paved the way for the bourgeois-led provisional government. But then the Bolsheviks, staying on top of things, were able to overthrow that as well and then begin building socialism after a 5-year civil war. Now, I think that we find ourselves in a similar position today. The USSR, of course, ceased to exist over 30 years ago, and all of those territories are now capitalist again. Russia specifically governing itself with an eye towards recreating the Tsarist empire in part. China as well, having been a major socialist power, which, although the Communist Party is still ruling it, is allowing major amounts of capitalism, and that type of activity is guiding some of its behavior as well. So we're dealing with a world that is in a highly advanced stage of capitalism. I mean, if before World War I, we were talking about Europe being in an advanced state of capitalism, all the more so over 100 years later. There are still some vestiges of socialism left in the world of 2022 today, and still some decent parties, but very few of them have any real power. I think that if we are to rebuild a movement of the type that Lenin was involved in, we have to do a lot of that building from the ground up again. Stop looking to established powers as sort of heroes, saviors, or even major examples to follow. Certainly in the case of Russia, whatever people think about China, certainly in the case of Russia, this is not socialism in any way, shape, or form. It's headed by the counter-revolutionary bourgeoisie, which oversaw the destruction of the USSR and the reshaping of the former USSR into the monster that it is today. Allying with that is allying with the bourgeoisie. That's not what we do as Marxist-Leninists, at least at this stage of historical development. It's one thing when capitalism is just overthrowing feudalism and is laying the groundwork for, the limited type of democracy that capitalism creates. But that ship sailed long ago. We're not in that stage anymore. So when we look at the major clash of rival imperial powers that is again taking shape on the world stage today, we see social chauvinists in abundance. These are people who are socialist in words, they call themselves socialists, but then they end up engaging in bourgeois chauvinistic behavior, taking national liberal positions, etc. So on the one side, we have people like Vosh and other sort of, quote, radlibs, who tend to call themselves socialists, but take the side of the United States. No, you cannot support the United States bourgeois government. It's the most aggressive imperial power in history. On the other side, you have people who fall into this sort of knee-jerk contrarianism, very little analysis, and they're just like, well, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I don't like the US bourgeoisie, so any other bourgeoisie that has a problem or stands up in any way against the US bourgeoisie, even if they're only standing up against the US bourgeoisie for a bigger slice of the global exploitation pie, well, then I'm going to support them. So you get a weird sort of social chauvinism, but not for your own country, for some other national bourgeoisie. But this is still opportunism. I mean, I guess we truly are living in a global age where opportunism has become this global. You can just sort of pick any country's bourgeoisie to support and stand by. Well, not if you're a socialist. The stance of socialism is to stand with the working class against the bourgeoisie. Now, I know that in the past, it was easier to say, well, we have all this territory, the USSR, on our side that is truly anti-imperialist, socialist, etc., or definitely China in some of its earlier stages, etc., as far as major powers commanding huge amounts of land and resources. Those were great times. Let us for a moment raise our glasses in celebration of what was achieved during that time by the immense effort and sacrifice of previous generations of socialists. But as soon as we've concluded that toast, we need a reality check. It's 2022, conditions have changed. The ground has shifted underneath us, and we are no longer living in that world. If we want it back, we have to build it again. We need a do-over, and no amount of squinting our eyes and deceiving ourselves about what we're looking at is going to change the fact that supporting the bourgeoisie is supporting the bourgeoisie. You're supporting your own exploitation. Cheering on the bourgeoisie and imperial war is cheering for death. That's what it is. At this point, so far, specifically I'm recording this today, August 6, 2022, large-scale war has not yet broken out between, say, the United States and another major power. But that could change next month or 2 months from now or next week. We really don't know. I get that it's scary, but if people do not, really quick, anyone who sincerely considers themselves a socialist and is currently backing some capitalist power in this fight, does not reorient yourselves, you are going to end up dragging down everybody around you. You have convinced that you're a socialist, etc. We need a reorientation of the working class against capitalism in every country. We are living in a world of imperialism where global financial groups are just that, global. They're active in China, they're active in Russia, etc., in Europe, all across the world. The struggle is for socialism, not for owning the libs, not for just throwing dirt in the eye of the United States, although to some extent we all like to see that. But any other power that continues down the path of highly advanced capitalism, imperialism, is going to end up exhibiting the same behavior that the United States does, because it is the nature of that economic mode. You have to get this through your head. Just because there is a baby imperialist power now that doesn't have as much blood on its hands yet, as of the present time, that does not mean that you can support it and still call yourself a Marxist. We're going to leave it there. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below. We'll continue the discussion in the comments section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening. And thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. Every donation is encouraging, but also materially helpful, and have allowed me to spend a lot more time creating content for this channel than I would have been able to do otherwise. So thanks again for that. Then after the content is up, engagement counts. Like it, share, subscribe, all of that stuff. Leave a comment, even if it's thanks, good video, or just random letters. All that's fine, and it will help YouTube to recommend this content to more people, keep the audience expanding, and keep this conversation going, which is imperative during this time of major global crisis for capitalism. The working class stands to lose a lot in a war in the 2020s, 2030s. We have to get organized now to stop it. But before we can get organized, we have to agitate and educate, at least to a basic level, where people have some idea of what to do. Thanks again, and we will see you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of two pieces by Lenin, the National Equality Bill and National Equality from March and April 1914, respectively. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So the first piece, the National Equality Bill, was published in Put Pravdy, number 48, March 28, 1914, and published here according to the text in Put Pravdy. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1972, Moscow, Volume 20, translated by Bernard Isaacs and the late Joe Feinberg. HTML transcription and markup by R. Simbala, and it's in the public domain. at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive, marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. So let's begin the National Equality Bill. Comrades, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Group in the Duma, Parliament, has decided to introduce in the Fourth Duma a bill to abolish the disabilities of the Jews and other non-Russians. Comment, by disabilities, he means discrimination against. That will be clear in a second. Anyway, continuing. The text of this bill you will find below. The bill aims at abolishing all national restrictions against all nations, Jews, Poles, and so forth. But it deals in particular detail with the restrictions against the Jews. The reason is obvious. No nationality in Russia is so oppressed and persecuted as the Jewish. Anti-Semitism is striking ever deeper root among the propertied classes. The Jewish workers are suffering under a double yoke, both as workers and as Jews. During the past few years, the persecution of the Jews has assumed incredible dimensions. It is sufficient to recall the anti-Jewish pogroms and the Bilas case. In view of these circumstances, organized Marxists must devote proper attention to the Jewish question. It goes without saying that the Jewish question can effectively be solved only together with the fundamental issues confronting Russia today. Obviously, we do not look to the nationalist Purishkevich Fourth Duma to abolish the restrictions against the Jews and other non-Russians. Comment, Purishkevich was the name of a very far-right politician. But it is in the duty of the working class to make its voice heard. And the voice of the Russian workers must be particularly loud in protest against national oppression. In publishing the text of our bill, we hope that the Jewish workers, the Polish workers, and the workers of the other oppressed nationalities will express their opinion of it and propose amendments, should they deem it necessary. At the same time, we hope that the Russian workers will give particularly strong support to our bill by their declarations, etc. In conformity with Article 4, we shall append to the bill a special list of regulations and laws to be rescinded. This appendix will cover about 100 such laws affecting the Jews alone. So, now the text. A bill for the abolition of all disabilities of the Jews and of all restrictions on the grounds of origin or nationality. 1. Citizens of all nationalities inhabiting Russia are equal before the law. 2. No citizen of Russia, regardless of sex and religion, may be restricted in political or in any other rights on the grounds of origin or nationality. 3. All and any laws, provisional regulations, riders to laws, and so forth, which impose restrictions upon Jews in any sphere of social and political life, are herewith abolished. Article 767, Volume 9, which states that, quote, Jews are subject to the general laws in all cases where no special regulations affecting them have been issued, unquote, is herewith repealed. All and any restrictions of the rights of Jews as regards residence and travel, the right to education, the right to state and public employment, electoral rights, military service, the right to purchase and rent real estate in towns, villages, etc., are herewith abolished, and all restrictions of the rights of Jews to engage in the liberal professions, etc., are herewith abolished. 4. To the present law is appended a list of the laws, orders, provisional regulations, etc., that limit the rights of the Jews and which are subject to repeal. And that's the end of the text. The list of appended laws, orders, etc. to be repealed is not included in this text. It probably would be fairly tedious. I'm sure you can find it somewhere if you look. So before moving on to the next text, national equality, let's just summarize what was said by Lenin here. So there is a footnote from MIA. It says the National Equality Bill, the official title of the Bill for the Abolition of All Disabilities of the Jews and of All Restrictions on the Grounds of Origin or Nationality, was drafted by Lenin for the Russian Social Democratic Labor Group in the Fourth Duma. This bill was to have been introduced in the Duma, apparently in connection with the discussion of the Ministry of the Interior's budget. In publishing this bill on behalf of the RSDL group, Lenin considered it a point of honor on the part of the Russian workers to support it with tens of thousands of signatures and declarations. Quote, this, said Lenin, will be the best means of consolidating complete unity, amalgamating all the workers of Russia, irrespective of nationality. So I agree. I think that this was an excellent effort. And just to summarize what Lenin said about it, he said the bill aims at abolishing all national restrictions on all nations, Jews, Poles, and everyone else, but It deals in particular with the restrictions against the Jews, and the reason is that no nationality was so immensely oppressed and persecuted as the Jewish. So that's important to say. There's nothing socialist about trying to wave away forms of oppression that are not specifically class-based. As Lenin said, this is the best means of consolidating complete unity and bringing together all the workers of Russia, irrespective of nationality. We just put up Stalin's Marxism and the National Question, which is all about this. Marxists seek to limit and reduce and eliminate national strife. The national project is fundamentally a bourgeois project, and proletarian internationalism seeks to overcome it, not to reinforce it. There are a few limited cases, particularly in the cases of just emerging capitalism, where sometimes workers may choose to get involved in a bourgeois-led national liberation struggle or struggle against national oppression. But as soon as possible, this should be converted into a proletariat-led struggle for internationalism. The last point I want to make on this is where Lenin says, obviously, we do not look to the nationalist Purishkevich Fourth Duma to abolish the restrictions against the Jews and other non-Russians. But it is the duty of the working class to make its voice heard, and the voice of the Russian workers must be particularly loud in protest against national oppression. So what's he saying here? Is that the Fourth Duma was dominated by nationalists and really even like early fascists like Purishkevich. So was the RSDLP, this group of Marxists, really affecting that, a nationalist, even fascist, severely reactionary dominated parliament was really going to solve the Jewish question? Purishkevich was extremely anti-Jewish. So no, of course they did not think so. That's why they said they do not look to the Duma to abolish these restrictions. However, they felt that it was the duty of the working class to make this protest, and in particular for the Russian workers. And this was a thing within the Russian Empire at that time, there was basically privilege of the, quote, Great Russian, that is Russian proper, not Ukrainian or any of the other nationalities within the Russian Empire. They felt that it was important for the most privileged, centered, Great Russian workers to say clearly, we reject this oppression. So, we don't consider ourselves little czars or little bourgeoisie. We are internationalist proletarians. We stand in solidarity with the oppressed Jews, although we ourselves are not Jews. And we don't want the government doing this oppression in our name. This is a formal protest, etc. So Lenin adds, it goes without saying that the Jewish question can effectively be solved only together with the fundamental issues confronting Russia. So to really get something done on this, there would have to be other fundamental issues that move as well. But again, they felt it was important to make the statement. And, you look at the kind of reactionary whining that supposed, totally half-assed, quote, Marxists try to do today. Anytime that women's rights or race or, any of these other questions that are not specifically class in and of themselves come up, I'm sorry, but this isn't Marxist and it's not Marxist-Leninist. So anyway, let's continue on to the second text. This is called National Equality. It was published in Put Pravdy number 62, April 16, 1914. Sources Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1972. Moscow, Volume 20, translated by Bernard Isaacs and the late Joe Feinberg. HTML transcription and markup by R. Zavala. And again, it's in the Lenin Internet Archive at Marxist.org. Let's read. Input Pravdy number 48, from March 28. The Russian Social Democratic Labor Group in the Duma published the text of its bill on national equality, or, to quote its official title, Bill for the Abolition of All the Disabilities of the Jews and All Restrictions on the Grounds of Origin or Nationality, the one we just read. Amidst the alarms and turmoil of the struggle for existence, for a bare livelihood, the Russian workers cannot and must not forget the yoke of national oppression under which the tens and tens of millions of subject peoples inhabiting Russia are groaning. The ruling nation, the Great Russians, constitute about 45% of the total population of the empire. Out of every 100 inhabitants, over 50 belong to, quote, subject peoples, i.e. not Russians proper. And the conditions of life of this vast population are even harsher than those of the Russians. The policy of oppressing nationalities is one of dividing nations. At the same time, it is a policy of systematic corruption of the people's minds. The Black Hundred's plans are designed to foment antagonism among the different nations, to poison the minds of the ignorant and downtrodden masses. Comment, who are the Black Hundreds? These were extreme reactionaries, monarchists, people who were violently committed to upholding the status quo at that time. Pick up any Black Hundred newspaper and you will find that the persecution of non-Russians, sowing of mutual distrust between the Russian peasant, the Russian petty bourgeois, and the Russian artisan on the one hand, and the Jewish, Finnish, Polish, Georgian, and Ukrainian peasants, petty bourgeois and artisans on the other, is meat and drink to the whole of this Black Hundred gang. So comment, what would be the equivalent of this kind of media today? Things like Breitbart, Fox News, PragerU, all the other reactionary trash that gets funded by billionaires and is put out there to, well, sow mutual distrust between people of different nationalities, etc., etc. Continuing. But the working class needs unity, not division. It has no more bitter enemy than the savage prejudices and superstitions which its enemies sow among the ignorant masses. The oppression of subject peoples is a double-edged weapon. It cuts both ways, against the subject peoples and against the Russian people. That is why the working class must protest most strongly against national oppression in any shape and form. It must counter the agitation of the Black Hundreds, who try to divert its attention to the baiting of non-Russians, by asserting its conviction as to the need for complete equality, for the complete and final rejection of all privileges for any one nation. The Black Hundreds carry on a particularly venomous hate campaign against the Jews. The Purishkeviches try to make the Jewish people the scapegoats for all their own sins. And that is why the RSDL group in the Duma did right in putting Jewish disabilities in the forefront of its bill. The schools, the press, the parliamentary rostrum, everything is being used to sow ignorant, savage, and vicious hatred of the Jews. This dirty and despicable work is undertaken not only by the scum of the Black Hundreds, but also by reactionary professors, scholars, journalists, and members of the Duma. Millions and thousands of millions of rubles are spent on poisoning the minds of the people. It is a point of honor for the Russian workers to have this bill against national oppression backed by tens of thousands of proletarian signatures and declarations. This will be the best means of consolidating complete unity, amalgamating all the workers of Russia, irrespective of nationality. That's the end of the audiobook. So there's something I'd like to highlight here before we close. It's where Lenin says, but the working class needs unity, not division. It has no more bitter enemy than the savage prejudices and superstitions which its enemies sow among the ignorant masses. The oppression of subject peoples, and this is the big part, the oppression of subject peoples, the more oppressed minorities, is a double-edged weapon. It cuts both ways, against these subject peoples and against the Russian people. That is why the working class must protest most strongly against national oppression in any shape and form. And then Lenin concludes by saying it's a point of honor for the Russian workers, and Russian is emphasized, to have this bill against national oppression backed by tens of thousands of proletarian signatures and declarations. So the point here is the right-wing media, and particularly the most reactionary of it, really puts out this blatant sort of call to hatred and racism and national oppression. And the target is not the ruling class. They're a tiny minority and they're already in charge. The target is, to quote Lenin, poisoning the minds of the ignorant and downtrodden masses. So you have average working people, the system barely gave them an education, and or they might not have made the most use of whatever education they were given, and they have the numbers, they're the majority of the population. So the ruling class needs their buy-in into ruling class ideology to enforce the kind of divisive ideology that's going to keep the ruling class on top. This is why Lenin calls it a double-edged sword. The ideology is obviously intended to oppress the, quote, subject peoples, in this case the non-Russians within the Russian Empire. But what does that do? Well, every Russian worker who stands there swinging this sword of hatred against these other nationalities and trying to get some sense of superiority or just favor from their own exploiters, the ruling class, for doing so on their behalf. But as they do that, they get cut by it themselves, because those people who they're helping the ruling class to oppress are their own potential allies against the class exploitation that the ruling class is perpetrating against both of them. You know, and one of the incentives it's important to mention for people, you know, engaging in this kind of thing, committing class suicide as it were, is that the short-term or even immediate gain of whatever sort of national privilege belonging to that nationality which is the most favored, you know, or treated the least harshly by the exploiting class, that tiny scrap of privilege sometimes seems more worth it to that worker who engages in that kind of oppression than, you know, the potentially, quote, you know, faraway utopian dream of overthrowing the exploiters. In other words, that in the case of the United States, whiteness can be an immediate short-term thing, an extreme compromise, because it doesn't get you that far, to say the least. All it really helps with is avoiding some of the absolute worst treatment, sometimes not even that. Well, that, you know, immediate tiny thing, for some people, they think that it's worth totally giving up on the longer-term project, which is much more fundamental and would result in a revolutionary realigning of society. We know that such a revolutionary realigning of society involving the abolition of capitalism is possible. It's been done in multiple countries. But for the people who have bought the line that this is a fiction, a fantasy, not really possible, some of them very cynically buy in to, you know, that little tiny crumb that the ruling class throws them of, hey, you're in the favored nationality among the exploited. We will be whatever percentage less horrible to you, and you get somebody to look down on. You know, a lot of people do cynically take that as the consolation prize, and also not just as a sort of rational calculation. You know, the ruling class doesn't really leave that up to chance. They try to lean on the scale as much as possible because in along all the messaging of bigotry and national hatred, etc., they mix in strong anti-communist, anti-socialist, anti-Marxist messaging. And it all has one effect, trying to force workers into thinking that this is the best you can do. You buy into our system of exploitation, and if you have the right skin color or are the right religion or whatever, then we will be X% less horrible to you, and you get somebody to look down on. This doesn't absolve workers who participate in that oppression from their responsibility. Ultimately, we are all responsible. It's the historical duty of the working class to abolish capitalism and build socialism. But as we socialists go about conducting our agitation and education, bear in mind that these are some of the things that you're going to come up against in people's minds, and some of the things that you're going to need to attack. So attack them you should. Point them out, call them out, encourage absolutely as much questioning of that exploiter logic and exploiter ideology as you can. Stand up to oppression to set the example every time that you can. And Lenin set a great example for this, one that we can continue to emulate today and keep setting that example for other working people in the present and future as we continue to build the unity required to abolish capitalism and build socialism. We're going to leave it there. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below in the comment section. We'll continue the discussion there as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening. And thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen.
Akira, you've lived a life dominated by doubt and fear. How do you step into bravery? You know, I actually took this question and I answered the question in one word. Step. Step. Step into bravery. That's how you step into bravery. Take the step. Step. Step into bravery. That's how you step into bravery. Take the step. Step. itself.